wait, hold on. You're telling me that Apple, the company behind the Macintoshes, the iMac, iPod, iPhone, iPad, and MacBook line, made a games console back in 1997? Well, okay, was it successful though? Oh, really? Ouch. I mean, why am I acting surprised? I totally expected that. Hey everyone, welcome to the third episode of Retro Tech, hosted by myself, Vex0r, the show in which we take a look at various technology products or events relating to tech from history, break them down, explain them, and even form new questions regarding if X product was successful or not, for example. Before we begin, however, I'd like to insert a shameless plug real quick. Number one, if you haven't seen my last two episodes of this series, I highly recommend watching them. The first is a documentary of the Nintendo Game Boy and how it impacted the 90s, and the second one asks the question about the Nintendo GameCube if by the literal definition of success it was or wasn't. So definitely check them out, link down below and on cards that you can click on throughout this episode. And number two, my Twitter, @Vex0r2, which I feel is important that you follow, as that's the only place you'll be able to get updates regarding future videos, polls for you to vote on ideas for future episodes or series, and so much more. Again, I highly recommend you follow. Anyways, back to the video. It's well known that almost every successful company throughout history has had their fair shares of high and low points. It's a natural occurrence for success. The saying goes, after all, you learn from your mistakes and grow because of that. The story of Apple computers, or just Apple today, is one of those. Unarguably, what is viewed by many to be one of their biggest mistakes, although I'd say valid from a certain viewpoint at the time, was the firing of Steve Jobs, one of the company's two founders, in 1985, when the company was considered still in its infancy, just turning 9 years old the same year. What happened next is what I would describe as a perfect metaphor for divorce and puberty. To summarize, the board of directors basically removed Jobs from the status of CEO, thus splitting up the company from one of its parents. After that came the task of transitioning the company away from Steve and his overall vision.
From Apple.
Oh, it was very painful. I'm not even sure I want to talk about it. What can I say? I hired the wrong guy.
That was Scully?
Yeah. And he destroyed everything I'd spent 10 years working for. Starting with me, but that wasn't the saddest part. I would have gladly left Apple if Apple would have turned out like I'd wanted it to.
Now, you know that awkward phase in your life where you transition from a preteen to an adult? Well, this phase for Apple being without Jobs, which we can pinpoint as being from 1986 into the late 90s, saw a steep and continuous decline for the company, almost, and I literally mean almost, resulting in bankruptcy. Why was this? To be honest, many reasons, most of which I don't even want to bring up for time concerns. The most significant reason, you may ask? Personally, for my research, I feel that would be because of Apple's newfound desire during this period of time to constantly submerge their feet in tech products that were seen as way out of left field, and consumers honestly just weren't enthralled or interested in them. It seemed as though by the early 90s, the computers in Apple computers was beginning to fade away, and fast. One of these gadgets that Apple would release was just before the literal end of these dark times, a games console made in collaboration with the toy developer Bandai, and is the product we're talking about today. Now, let me be clear, there's little to no information on this console that I could find in terms of having various sources, due to just how little the device sold and made an actual impact or significance. I did, however, manage to find one source for which most of this video will be based on. Shout out to 512pixels.net for the information, links to them in the description down below. Anyways, our story of this console actually goes back to 1994. Apple is currently in this innovative pre-teen phase, as we talked about before, pushing out products left and right that just really don't make any sense for a computer company to develop. Just from this website Fossbytes, which lists about 21 of the weirdest Apple products ever made / thought of, meaning concepts, we can identify hot garbage, I mean great technological feats such as the Apple Time Band, the Apple Power CD, the Apple One Scanner, and the Apple Quick Take 100, to name a few. So this Japanese toy / game developer Bandai comes to Apple and basically asks to collaborate with them on a scaled down Mac for CD-ROM based gaming. They quickly get to work on a deal, and is agreed upon that Apple would work on the internals while Bandai the casing, controls, and packaging for this device. Now, while it's common for companies to collaborate with others, networking, branching out, etc., understandable, a lot of you are probably wondering just why Bandai decided to do this in the first place. Taking a look at their situation during this time puts the pieces together very quickly. Basically, at this time, Bandai's previous game console, the Palladia, was on the market already, but failing. The company looked to Apple to supply its hardware expertise to make something more powerful and ultimately more fun. Could damn well call it a tit-for-tat type scenario. Anyways, less than a year after that initial meeting, a prototype of the console was shown off in Monterey County, California, to about 30 companies who also wrote CD-ROM games at the time. However, much to their misfortune, it was deemed as somewhat underwhelming. Apple had their hands tied with another project at this time working on the Power PC. Both Apple and Bandai quickly scrambled, changed gears, and reworked the machine. Now, let's take a look at not only the specs of this device, but the initial launch as well. It's now 1995, and it's time to release this bad boy on the market. From the get-go, the Pippin was already up against stiff competition in the forms of the Sega Saturn and the original PlayStation. When you take a look at the end numbers, it really didn't do too well. Now, for what reason might it have flopped, you're probably thinking to yourself. Was it because the console lacked the necessary specs to compete alongside its competitors? No. Not really, but let's have a look at them anyway. From the 512pixels.net page, which again is linked top line of the description, there's a clickable link pictured now that when clicked on, unbelievably, takes you to the official Apple website. The one we're all accustomed to by now, as you can see. Where 23 years after the Pippin's release lies a page dedicated to the console, published in 2012 respectively. The specs are divided into multiple sections, the most important of which being hardware, video, and software. Now, let's be honest, since not too many people are interested in someone reading each spec and going over it, wasting time, I'm instead going to showcase a screenshot of each section now. So for those who are interested in specs, and I'll pause the video now and read what you will. Anyways, what I'm interested in more is the real reason why it flopped as hard as it did. The price. Oh boy, the price. Yeah, at $599 plus tax US, I'm sure nobody in their right mind immediately rushed out to buy it. This was single-handedly the biggest issue for the longevity of the Pippin. To give you a perspective of just how much money you were spending on Pippin in 1995, using today's money, as of the time this is being recorded in 2018, it would total an astonishing $992 US without tax. This is due to inflation, which you can read about on screen now, plus the formula on how to get this number. Now, to be fair, if the Pippin was looked at as a computer, considering it did grant users the ability to browse online, it was fairly cheap. In the late 1980s and early 1990s, Macs were astoundingly pricey, even by today's standards. Top-of-the-line Macs, for instance, cost a whopping $4,300. Unfortunately, though, by the time the Pippin hit stores in early 1996, consumers compared that price tag not with computers with features that extended far beyond the Pippin's technological capabilities, but instead to the $299 original PlayStation and Nintendo's $250 N64. To make matters worse for the console, it also came with a vapid, washed out, and bland lineup of games. Gamers could only choose from just 22 available titles, one of which being a literal web browser. Say what you will, But a lack of strong games, regardless of any console/brand, is pretty much the kiss of death for itself. The fierce price competition, as well as the lack of games, led to an extreme lack of sales. In the end, Apple sold only 42,000 Pippins out of the 100,000 initially built. By mid-1996, sales were disappointingly low with no signs of improvement, and as a result, developer interest continued to stay low. Also in that year, then Apple CEO Michael Spindler was replaced by Gil Amelio, and production for the console ended with Bandai having to ship thousands of unsold units back to Japan. Now, during this whole time of Apple's phase, how was its ex-CEO Steve Jobs doing? Pretty well, I'm not gonna lie. He went on during the 90s to acquire Pixar Studios and founded a new computer company called Next Inc. from the $70 million worth of shares that he had sold off from Apple previously. Quick fun fact, after that whole transaction, he had all but one share left in the company. Anyways, Next wasn't necessarily considered a commercial success, mostly due in part to its high price. However, its computer would introduce important concepts to the history of the PC, including serving as the initial platform for the great Tim Berners-Lee as he was developing the World Wide Web in 1989. So why did I mention all of this? Well, because the tables changed on July 7th, 1997, as headlines broke countrywide that Jobs was back.
And on the subject of technology, Apple Computer has claimed another victim. The company's chairman and CEO, Gilbert Amelio, abruptly resigned yesterday. He assumed the position in February 1996 with a mandate to turn the company around. During his brief tenure, however, Apple continued to lose money and market share. Company founder Steve Jobs, who has returned to Apple as an advisor, will now take a broader role in its redirection.
With Steve now reinstated as CEO, he quickly began restructuring Apple to save it from the bottomless pit it was heading down. This would mean that the final death call for Pippin would ring, as one of Jobs' first decisions back as CEO was to effectively and quickly dismantle the Pippin initiative, thus ending Apple's first attempt at a gaming console. It would later be fully discontinued in December of 2002, marking it the last time that you could get your hands on the device. With that being said, was I able to find a single post/memory, and a positive one at that, from anyone that got their hands on Pippin back in 1997? I mean, what would this series be without a review on the product we're talking about after all? Well, you're about to find out. It wasn't easy, guys. I seriously mean that. I tried searching every nook and cranny on the internet for a personal story or memory gaming on Pippin, but it was almost near impossible to find one. Thankfully, though, I found one forum on Polygon from a few years back that, rather than focusing on personal stories, at least acknowledged rightful criticism and even praise towards Apple, etc. For instance, this user wrote short and simply, quote, "Pippin, like the Newton, was too far ahead of its time in what they were trying to accomplish," end quote. Newton in this scenario being the infamous Apple Newton, or the iPad of the 90s, which also failed much like Pippin, not to be confused by the Newton that discovered gravity like 300 years ago. Also, if you want me to do a future video on the Apple Newton, let me know down in the comments below. The same person further adds to what they meant by this, replying to a comment below theirs, quote, "They were too ambitious and could not execute. A lot of what they were trying to do back then, modern consoles only started doing in the last 2 generations. The general controller shape, connectivity, wireless controller, lack of region locks, even the web browsing," end quote. Meanwhile, another user took a different approach, surprisingly praising Bandai during this situation. Quote, "Bandai had the Herculean task of establishing a new, expensive console amidst more established brands. The Pippin Atmark and Atworld's competitors, Atmark and Atworld referencing the 2 separate colored editions of the console, included the Super Nintendo, Sega Saturn, and Sony's newborn PlayStation, as well as Windows PC games. These consoles had strong name recognition and dedicated fan bases, popular with both consumers and developers," end quote. Finally, the last post I'm showcasing here criticizes the Pippin, but from a technical perspective. Quote, "For a 1995 system, this thing was woefully underpowered. The 603 Power PC CPU is the only thing beefy about it. It probably should have had a really nice 32-bit 2D/3D chip to better compete with the PS1 and Sega Saturn at the time," end quote. Overall, it seems to be that the lack of a fan base, that most of the sentimental stories by users found in other devices like the Game Boy, Xbox 360, and PS2 for instance, are just non-existent with the Pippin. The general consensus around many is that the console itself, including the marketing, was handled very poorly, and along with the ludicrous price tag, also contributed to the high lack of sales. But back to Apple themselves, let's expand a bit from before on what happened to the company after Steve Jobs' return as CEO. According to Vox, when Jobs took the reins again, the company was in tough shape. It had a bewildering array of products, no clear strategy, and was losing tens of millions of dollars every quarter. He acted decisively. He canceled 70% of Apple's products, including the Pippin, and laid off more than 3,000 people, turning a $1 billion loss in 1997 into a $300 million profit in 1998. Then he started work building products that became Silicon Valley legends. The iMac in 1998, the iPod in 2001, and the most important of them, the iPhone in 2007. The device with what you're probably watching this video on right now. Either that or an iPad worked on in 2010. On August 2nd, 2018, Apple became the world's first trillion-dollar public company. I guess you could say that Apple got the happy ending it needed. And thus, the story of the Apple Pippin comes to an end. Doomed before and after arrival, never having the opportunity at establishing itself among the consoles of the day, nor establishing a fan base behind it. The number of games it offered was extremely disappointing, and the titles themselves were mediocre at best. 512 Pixels summarizes it best in their concluding statements on this whole saga. Quote, "The Pippin is maybe the finest example of the bonkers projects Apple was trying in the mid-1990s. Instead of focusing on its core product, Apple let the Macintosh grow stale and bloated, while putting untold hours and money behind things like the Pippin and other dead-end technology." End quote. Who knows? Maybe in an alternate timeline the Pippin could have succeeded. There was potential to be found primarily in its specs. But unfortunately, history is history, and that potential went to waste. But anyways guys, thank you so much for watching this video. If you enjoyed, don't forget to click that subscribe button and notification bell to get updates on whenever I upload. And most importantly, follow me on Twitter at Vex0r2, not only for updates, polls to vote on ideas, etc., but also that starting from the next episode of this series, I'll be uploading trailers or previews for future episodes onto there. So if you're interested in all that, definitely give me a follow. Links in the description below. Again, thank you for watching, and have yourself a wonderful day.